Imagine, for a moment, a question that feels almost unsettling in its logic. If you were Satan, where would you hide the light so that no one could ever find it? Would you bury it deep within darkness, in places already consumed by corruption and despair? Or would you conceal it somewhere no one would suspect, perhaps in plain sight, within a world that believes it already understands truth? This question is more than a philosophical exercise. It opens a doorway into a paradox that history itself seems to embody. Because there was, in fact, a place where light should never have survived, yet somehow it did. That place is Rome. In the ancient world, Rome was not associated with holiness or spiritual purity. It was the embodiment of earthly power at its most absolute. Every road led to it, every nation eventually bowed before it, and every system within it was engineered to reinforce control. Law was not merely a framework for justice, it was an instrument of domination. Military strength was not only a means of defense, but a constant reminder of what happened to those who resisted. And beneath it all, there was an unspoken force holding everything together: fear. This was not a city of hope, it was a machine of order built on discipline, hierarchy, and the relentless assertion of authority. Yet within this very environment, something profoundly unexpected began to take shape. Not through conquest, not through political strategy, but through something far more fragile and yet far more enduring: faith. The paradox is striking. If light has any true meaning, it does not reveal itself where everything is already illuminated. It becomes most visible, most powerful, when it emerges against the deepest darkness. And Rome was precisely that darkness. This was a place where human life could be reduced to spectacle, where death was not feared, but consumed as entertainment. In massive arenas, crowds gathered to watch bloodshed unfold, cheering as individuals were torn apart by beasts or forced into brutal combat. Violence was not an anomaly, it was a cultural norm. To understand why the emergence of faith in Rome was so transformative, one must first grasp the structure of the empire itself. Rome was not simply a nation, it was a system designed for total control. Its laws functioned as tools of enforcement, ensuring compliance through consequence. Its armies projected power both outward and inward, suppressing rebellion before it could take root. And above all, loyalty was non-negotiable. The emperor was not just a ruler, he was elevated to a near divine status. To refuse allegiance was not merely a personal conviction, it was seen as a direct threat to the stability of the empire. In such a world, any belief that acknowledged a higher authority than the emperor was inherently dangerous. It disrupted the very foundation upon which Roman power stood. And this is precisely why the earliest believers in God were not simply misunderstood, they were targeted. Their refusal to conform was interpreted not as devotion, but as defiance. At the same time, Roman society had grown deeply accustomed to violence. Structures like the Colosseum were not just places of entertainment, they were symbols of a worldview in which life itself could be commodified. When a civilization reaches the point where death becomes spectacle, it reveals something profound about its moral condition. Human beings are no longer seen as inherently valuable, they become instruments for the satisfaction of the crowd. In that context, the idea of a faith centered on compassion, sacrifice, and the intrinsic worth of every individual was not just unfamiliar, it was almost incomprehensible. And yet, this is where the paradox deepens. Instead of being extinguished in such a hostile environment, faith began to take root. Not in palaces or centers of influence, but in hidden spaces, behind closed doors, beneath the ground, within small and quiet gatherings. There were no armies, no political leverage, no institutional protection. There was only belief. And somehow, that was enough. What made this movement fundamentally different from anything Rome had encountered was its nature. It did not rely on visible power. It could not be easily measured, controlled, or suppressed. Laws could dictate behavior, and force could compel obedience, but neither could reach into the inner convictions of the human soul. And it is precisely there, in that invisible space, that this faith began to grow. This marked the beginning of a reversal that no one could have anticipated. An empire built on tangible strength found itself confronted by something intangible. A system sustained by fear encountered individuals who, in a profound and disarming way, were no longer governed by that fear. And in that collision, something unexpected happened. Not immediately, not dramatically, but inevitably. A question began to form. It emerged first in the minds of those who watched from a distance, spectators in the arenas, soldiers carrying out orders, officials enforcing the law. They witnessed people who did not respond to suffering in the expected way. These individuals did not beg, did not curse, did not renounce what they believed. Instead, they faced death with a kind of quiet resolve that was difficult to explain. It was not that they lacked fear altogether, but that their fear no longer held ultimate power over them. And that difference was enough to disrupt the assumptions of an entire system. Because once such a question takes root, what gives these people such strength? It does not easily disappear. It lingers, it spreads, it moves from one mind to another, from one conversation to the next. And from those questions, something greater begins to emerge, something subtle, gradual, yet impossible to contain. In a place where everything was designed to maintain control, something uncontrollable had begun. Out of that tension, between absolute control and something strangely uncontrollable, the earliest Christian communities began to emerge within Rome. They did not arrive as a movement of influence or ambition. There were no banners announcing their presence, no institutions backing their expansion, no strategies aimed at seizing power. In fact, by every conventional standard of history, they should have failed before they even began. They possessed none of the elements typically required to transform a society. No political leverage, no military strength, no cultural dominance. What they had was something far less tangible and yet far more disruptive: belief. These early Christians were, in almost every sense, invisible. They gathered quietly, often in private homes or hidden underground spaces, not to organize resistance but simply to remain faithful to what they believed to be true. Their meetings were not displays of strength, but acts of persistence. They did not attempt to overthrow the system. They existed within it, yet refused to be defined by it. This alone made them an anomaly. In a world where identity was tightly bound to allegiance, where loyalty to the emperor was both civic duty and spiritual expectation, these individuals introduced a fracture. They lived under Roman rule, but their ultimate allegiance lay elsewhere. At the center of this quiet but profound shift stood a figure who, by all outward measures, would have seemed unlikely to influence history: Saint Peter. He was not a philosopher, not a general, not a statesman. He had no formal authority in the structures that governed the empire. And yet, what he carried into Rome was not power in the traditional sense, but a message, one that would prove more resilient than any system built on force. He did not come to conquer territory. He came to plant something far less visible, but far more enduring: a seed. That seed was not planted in fertile ground. It took root in an environment that was, by all appearances, hostile to its very existence. But this is precisely what made it powerful. Because a belief that survives under pressure does not merely exist, it deepens. It transforms from an idea into a conviction, from a conviction into an identity. And once belief reaches that level, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to extinguish. Inevitably, this growing presence could not remain unnoticed. The Roman Empire, with its finely tuned mechanisms of control, began to recognize that something was not aligning with its expectations. The issue was not simply that these Christians believed differently. Rome had absorbed countless cultures and religions into its vast structure. Diversity in itself was not the threat. The problem was refusal. These individuals did not merely add another god to the Roman pantheon, they rejected the system that required such integration. At the core of the conflict was a single, uncompromising stance. They would not worship the emperor. In Roman ideology, this was not a minor religious difference, it was a direct challenge to authority. The emperor's divinity was not just symbolic, it was foundational to the unity of the empire. To deny it was to step outside the system entirely. And in a structure built on order, anything that existed outside of it could not be tolerated. Thus, the conflict was not accidental, it was inevitable. Christians were not persecuted because they were misunderstood. They were persecuted because they could not be assimilated. Their loyalty was not negotiable, and that made them dangerous in a way that armies and revolts were not. A rebellion could be crushed. A belief that refused to yield could not. The response of the empire followed a pattern it had perfected over centuries. Pressure was applied, at times subtly, at times brutally. Individuals were arrested, interrogated, and given a choice: conform or suffer the consequences. It was a system designed to break resistance efficiently. Most movements, when faced with such force, eventually collapse. Fear does what it is designed to do, it compels survival. But here, something did not function as expected. Those who were captured did not always recant. Those who were threatened did not always yield. And those who were sentenced to death did not always respond with despair. Instead, accounts began to circulate, quiet at first, then more widely, of individuals who faced execution with a composure that defied logic. They did not plead in the ways one would expect. They did not curse their fate or abandon their convictions in their final moments. They held on to them. This was not the reaction Rome had anticipated. The machinery of fear depends on a predictable outcome, that when the cost becomes high enough, people will choose survival over principle. But when individuals begin to accept suffering rather than betray what they believe, that calculation breaks down. The system loses its leverage. And this is where the paradox intensifies. Because instead of extinguishing the movement, persecution began to amplify it. Each act of execution, intended as a warning, became something else entirely, a demonstration. Not of weakness, but of conviction. Not of defeat, but of something that seemed, to outside observers, strangely unbreakable. The phenomenon is difficult to overstate. The more the empire attempted to suppress this belief, the more visible it became. Not through propaganda or organized expansion, but through the very acts meant to destroy it. A person could be silenced, but the memory of how they faced death could not. And that memory carried weight. It raised questions. What gives someone the strength to endure suffering without surrender? What kind of belief remains intact under such pressure? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what if that belief is true? These questions did not remain isolated. They moved, quietly, persistently, through the social fabric of Rome. From spectators in the arenas to soldiers enforcing the law, from ordinary citizens to those within the structures of power. Curiosity is not easily contained, especially when it is born from contradiction. The empire expected fear to produce compliance. Instead, it witnessed suffering producing something else: influence. This is the mechanism at the heart of the paradox. Death, which was meant to end the movement, began to inspire it. Behavior, which was meant to be suppressed, began to provoke reflection. The very visibility of persecution created a kind of unintended testimony. Each life taken did not close a chapter, it opened one. And so, what began as a small, almost imperceptible presence within Rome started to expand, not by force, but by resonance, not by domination, but by the quiet, persistent spread of a question that refused to disappear. In a system built to control outcomes, something had emerged that could not be controlled at all. What followed was not an explosion, but a quiet shift, so gradual that, at first, it almost escaped notice. There was no singular moment when everything changed, no decisive event that marked a clear turning point. Instead, something far more subtle unfolded within Rome, a transformation that moved beneath the surface of power, spreading not through force, but through influence of a very different kind. The message carried by the early Christians did not advance through conquest or decree, it moved through people. It began among ordinary citizens, those who witnessed, who questioned, who remembered. The arenas that were once designed to display dominance and instill fear began, unintentionally, to produce something else: reflection. A spectator who once came for entertainment left with a question. A soldier tasked with enforcing order began to hesitate internally, even if not outwardly. Over time, those questions did not disappear, they accumulated. This is how the shift began to propagate, quietly, almost imperceptibly, from one layer of society to another. From the common people to the guards who watched over prisoners, from the guards to officials responsible for maintaining order, and eventually even into the consciousness of those positioned within the structures of authority. Not all at once, and not uniformly, but enough to begin altering the internal dynamics of the empire itself. What makes this transformation particularly striking is not just that it happened, but how it happened. It did not rely on the mechanisms that typically drive change within powerful systems. There were no uprisings, no organized campaigns to seize control, no attempts to infiltrate political institutions in the conventional sense. The early Christians did not attempt to outmaneuver Rome at its own game. They operated outside of it entirely. They did not use violence because their message was fundamentally incompatible with it. They did not pursue political power because their authority did not depend on institutional recognition. Instead, what they possessed, and what proved unexpectedly effective, were three elements that could not be easily regulated or suppressed: stories, memory, and witness. Stories carried the essence of what they believed, not abstract doctrines, but lived experiences, accounts of individuals who remained steadfast under pressure, who chose conviction over survival, who embodied something that others could not easily explain. These stories were not broadcast through formal channels. They were shared person to person, in conversations, in recollections, in quiet retellings that gave them a kind of resilience. A story, once heard, can be questioned, but it cannot be unseen. Memory ensured that these stories endured, even when individuals were removed, imprisoned, executed, silenced. Their actions did not vanish with them. They remained in the minds of those who had witnessed them. And memory has a unique property. It does not obey authority. It cannot be commanded to disappear. The more something attempts to suppress it, the more significance it often acquires. And then there was witness, the act of living in a way that reflected belief. This was perhaps the most disruptive element of all, because it required no platform, no permission, no visibility beyond the immediate. A life lived with consistency under pressure becomes its own form of communication. It cannot be easily dismissed because it does not rely on argument alone. It presents evidence, not in theory, but in reality. Together, these elements created a form of influence that operated beneath the level of direct control. Rome could regulate speech, enforce laws, and punish defiance, but it could not fully intercept the movement of stories, the persistence of memory, or the impact of lived example. And so, the transformation continued, not rapidly, not dramatically, but steadily. As time passed, this invisible current began to intersect with something more tangible. The deaths that once symbolized the suppression of a movement started to acquire a different meaning. They were no longer seen solely as endings. In a way that even the empire could not fully comprehend, they became points of origin. Nowhere is this reversal more clearly embodied than in the memory of St. Peter. His death, like that of many others, was intended to mark a conclusion, to serve as a final statement of authority, a demonstration that resistance would not endure. And yet, over time, that very place associated with his death began to be remembered differently, not as a site of defeat, but as a foundation. This is where the transformation moves from the invisible to the visible. A structure began to rise above the place believed to hold his remains. Not immediately and not without the passage of time, but eventually, deliberately. What was once hidden beneath the ground, marked by suffering, by execution, by what appeared to be the silencing of a voice, became the basis upon which something enduring was built. The symbolism is profound. Beneath the structure lies death. Above it stands something that represents continuity, meaning, and, ultimately, triumph. This is not triumph in the sense that Rome would have understood it, won through battle or secured by dominance, but a different kind altogether. It is the triumph of persistence over eradication, of belief over suppression. The construction of what would become a central place of worship was not merely an architectural decision. It was a statement, one that did not need to be spoken loudly to be understood. It declared that what had been intended as an ending had, in fact, become a beginning, that what was meant to erase had instead established. This is the inversion in its most complete form. A site associated with execution becomes a place of gathering. A memory tied to loss becomes a source of identity. A life taken becomes a point of continuity that extends far beyond the individual. And in that inversion, something is revealed about the nature of the transformation itself. It does not simply replace one system with another. It redefines the meaning of the very events that were meant to prevent it. Within Rome, a city once defined by its ability to assert control over life and death, there now stood a growing reminder that not everything could be concluded by force, that beneath the visible structures of power, something else had taken root, something that could absorb pressure, reinterpret suffering, and emerge not diminished, but strengthened. And perhaps most significantly, this transformation did not erase the past. The memory of what Rome had been, its violence, its authority, its reliance on fear, did not disappear. Instead, it became part of the story. It became the contrast that made the transformation meaningful. Because without the darkness, the emergence of light would not carry the same weight. What had once been a symbol of finality had become a symbol of beginning. And that shift, once established, could not easily be undone. As this quiet transformation deepened, something even more remarkable began to take shape within Rome. What had once been the epicenter of imperial dominance gradually became the foundation for an entirely different kind of authority, one that did not rely on legions, decrees, or territorial expansion. Instead of another empire rising from the ruins of the old, a new kind of center emerged, one defined not by the ability to control bodies, but by the capacity to reach the human spirit. This center would eventually be known as Vatican City. Unlike the Roman Empire at its height, Vatican City was never built to dominate through force. It did not command vast armies, nor did it seek to conquer land in the traditional sense. Its influence operated along an entirely different axis. Where Rome once imposed order through fear, this new center extended influence through meaning, continuity, and belief. It did not replace one system of power with another equivalent structure. It introduced a fundamentally different model of what power could be. This distinction is critical, because what emerged was not simply a shift in leadership, but a shift in paradigm. The authority associated with Vatican City was not rooted in coercion. It did not depend on the threat of punishment or the enforcement of compliance. Instead, it derived its strength from something far less visible, but far more enduring: legitimacy grounded in continuity. At the center of that continuity stands the figure of Saint Peter. The significance of his role extends far beyond his lifetime. He was not merely an early leader among believers. He became, over time, the symbolic foundation of an unbroken line. This idea of succession, of one leader following another, each connected to the same origin, created something rare in history, a sense of permanence that did not depend on political stability. The Bishop of Rome, later known as the Pope, came to be understood not simply as an administrator or figurehead, but as the successor to Saint Peter. This succession is not merely ceremonial. It functions as a connective thread that links generations across centuries, preserving a continuity that transcends the rise and fall of empires. Where political systems fracture, reform, and often collapse, this line of succession maintains a narrative of consistency. This continuity matters because it transforms what might otherwise be seen as a historical movement into something that appears ongoing, alive rather than concluded. Each new pope does not represent a break from the past, but a continuation of it. And in that continuity, the original seed planted in a hostile environment continues to bear influence far beyond its initial context. What makes this development even more striking is where it occurs. The same city that once enforced allegiance to an emperor as divine now becomes the seat of a spiritual authority that transcends national boundaries. Rome does not lose its historical identity, but it acquires a new dimension, one that redefines its role in the world. It becomes not merely a relic of past power, but a living center of a different kind of influence. This raises an important question. Why here? Why would such a transformation occur in a place so deeply associated with control, violence, and domination? Why not begin in a location more aligned with the values being introduced, somewhere quieter, more receptive, less resistant? The answer lies not only in history, but in strategy. At the time, Rome was, in many ways, the center of the known world. It was not just a political capital, it was a hub of connectivity. Roads stretched outward in every direction, linking distant regions into a single network. Cultures converged there, ideas passed through it, influence radiated from it. To place anything within Rome was, in effect, to place it at a point of maximum exposure. If the goal were to ensure that a message remained contained, Rome would be the worst possible choice. But if the goal were to allow that message to spread, organically, persistently, across boundaries, there would be few locations more effective. In this sense, the selection of Rome is not accidental. It aligns with a logic that prioritizes reach over comfort, impact over ease. There is also a deeper principle at work, one that moves beyond geography into meaning. Light, by its very nature, does not exist for itself. It reveals, it contrasts, it defines what surrounds it. But for light to be perceived in its fullness, it must encounter darkness. In a space already illuminated, light adds little. It does not challenge, it does not transform, it simply blends in. But when it appears in darkness, it changes everything. It redefines the environment, it alters perception, it creates distinction where none existed before. This is why the emergence of faith within Rome carries such significance. It is not merely that belief survived in a difficult place, it is that the place itself amplified the meaning of that belief. The contrast made it visible, the resistance made it resilient, the opposition clarified its identity. Had the same movement begun in a context already aligned with its values, it might have remained local, limited, or unnoticed. But within Rome, every aspect of its existence was sharpened by what surrounded it. Every act of persistence stood out more clearly against a backdrop of control. Every expression of conviction carried greater weight in a system built on compliance. In this way, the environment that seemed least suitable became, paradoxically, the most effective. The very conditions that should have prevented growth instead contributed to it. And the city that once represented the height of human authority became the stage upon which a different understanding of authority could emerge. This does not mean the transition was simple or immediate. It unfolded over time, shaped by countless individual decisions, sacrifices, and moments of quiet conviction. But as those moments accumulated, they formed a pattern, one that, in retrospect, reveals a kind of coherence. The placement of light within darkness is not random, it is purposeful, and within Rome, that purpose becomes visible, not through a single event, but through the convergence of history, belief, and the enduring impact of a choice that, at first glance, seems almost impossible to understand. As the historical, structural, and symbolic layers converge, the narrative reaches its deepest philosophical tension, one that moves beyond events and enters the realm of principles, because at the heart of everything that unfolded in Rome lies a question not about geography or politics, but about the nature of darkness itself. Darkness, by definition, does not resist what already belongs to it. It does not struggle against spaces that are already consumed by it, because there is no opposition there. A world fully aligned with darkness requires no defense. It sustains itself. This is why, paradoxically, darkness does not fear more darkness. There is no threat in what is already under its influence, no tension, no disruption. But something entirely different happens when light appears, not just any light, but light that emerges from within darkness itself. This is the critical distinction. Light that exists in isolation, separated from struggle, can be dismissed. It can be ignored, contained, or perceived as irrelevant to harsher realities. But light that is born out of darkness, light that has endured pressure, contradiction, and opposition, carries a different kind of authority. It cannot be easily reduced or explained away because it has already confronted the very conditions that should have extinguished it. And this is precisely what occurred within Rome. The transformation of Rome is not simply a historical anomaly. It is a direct challenge to the assumption that certain environments are beyond redemption. Because if a place so deeply associated with violence, domination, and systemic control can become a center of spiritual influence, then the boundaries we assume to be fixed begin to dissolve. The idea that darkness is permanent, that it defines a place, a system, or even a person, no longer holds. This is why the most threatening form of light is not the one that shines from a distance, but the one that rises from within what was once considered lost. Because that kind of light proves something. It proves that darkness is not absolute. It proves that transformation is possible, even under the most resistant conditions. And perhaps most importantly, it proves that what appears final may not be final at all. At this point, the narrative shifts, almost inevitably, from history to the individual. Because the story of Rome is not only about a city, it becomes a framework through which we can examine something far more immediate, the internal landscape of human experience. In that sense, Rome is not just a location in the past. It becomes a metaphor, a representation of what might be called a personal Rome. Every individual carries spaces within themselves that resemble this idea, areas marked by failure, by regret, by decisions that cannot be undone. Patterns of thought or behavior that feel entrenched, resistant to change. Moments that, once past, seem to define everything that follows. These are the internal equivalents of darkness, not always visible, not always spoken about, but deeply felt. And just as with Rome, the instinct is often to assume that these spaces are fixed, that what has been established cannot be reversed, that distance from what is good, true, or meaningful has become too great to overcome. But the narrative challenges that assumption directly. If transformation could begin in a place like Rome, not instantly, not easily, but genuinely, then the same principle applies on a personal level. The starting point does not determine the outcome. The presence of darkness does not eliminate the possibility of light. In fact, it may be the very condition that gives that light its significance. This leads to a crucial realization. Change does not begin externally. It does not require ideal circumstances, complete clarity, or immediate resolution. It begins internally, with a shift that may be almost imperceptible at first. A decision, a recognition, a willingness to move, even slightly, in a different direction. In the same way that the transformation of Rome did not occur through a single event, personal change rarely happens all at once. It unfolds over time, shaped by repeated choices, reinforced by persistence, and sustained by meaning. And just as the early Christians did not rely on force or visibility, this kind of change does not depend on external validation. It is, at its core, internal. This is why the message embedded in this entire narrative carries such weight. No one is too far removed to return. No condition is so fixed that it cannot be reinterpreted. No past is so definitive that it completely determines the future. The significance of Rome, then, is not limited to what it once was or even what it became. It lies in what it represents, a transition from one state to another that should not have been possible, yet was. Rome becomes a symbol, not of perfection, but of transformation, not of an absence of darkness, but of its reversal. And from that symbol emerges a principle that extends far beyond any single place or period of history. There is no space so dark that light cannot reach it. This is not an abstract idea. It is a pattern, one that has repeated itself across time, contexts, and individual lives. It is visible wherever something broken is restored, wherever something lost is found, wherever meaning emerges from what once appeared empty. And perhaps that is where the story ultimately settles, not in the past, but in the present. Not as a distant account, but as an ongoing possibility. Because the same dynamic that transformed Rome does not belong exclusively to history. It continues to operate, often quietly, often unnoticed, but persistently. And recognizing that dynamic is not simply an intellectual exercise, it is an invitation to reconsider what we assume cannot change, an invitation to look at what appears fixed and ask whether it truly is, and an invitation to remain attentive to the possibility that light may already be closer than we think. If this journey, from darkness to light, from control to meaning, from history to personal transformation, has given you a new perspective, consider staying connected. Follow the channel, subscribe for more explorations like this, and share it with others who might be asking similar questions. Because sometimes, a single idea, encountered at the right moment, can become the beginning of something far greater than expected.